What is good? Welcome back. So I want to cover the estrogenic effects of EQ and Primo. Now, not just like random sciencey stuff that you could look up, but actual real world application of helping you dial in your estrogen when you're running one of these drugs. Now, there's certain things you need to look out for depending on which one you're running. And there's also things you need to know that might be a little bit nuanced or overcomplicated, but it could really help you in certain situations. Now, whether this is your first time running one of these, you're upping the dose, you're switching from one compound to the other, any of these situations, this video is going to be a good starting point, and we're going to get in depth a little bit on certain things that are actually really important to know. So let's start off with ratios. These are simple. You can take it away from the video and use the information. Okay, so if you want to keep it simple, test and Primo, you want to do 2 parts test, 1 part Primo. If you test an EQ, you want to do 3 parts test to 1 part EQ. Now, these are just starting ranges, but these are what I see for most people to keep their estrogen in a good, decent range, okay? Everybody's different, but for most people, that is a good starting point. Now I'm going to put some charts up on the screen here. The Primobolan one is going to be more accurate and more useful. I have more data points for that one, and the numbers matter more. Now, what I mean by that is the EQ, we'll get into that in a little bit, but your E2 is going to be tanked, but you also have E1 in the system. So even though your E2 might be completely bottomed out when you're running EQ, the numbers matter a little bit less, but just keep in mind, this is generally what I see between most people and their E2 blood levels when they get it done, running this dose of test and this dose of the other compound. So the first little thing we need to cover is that your ratio that worked for you at one dose might not work for you at a higher or lower dose. Now, the reason is because if you increase your testosterone dosage, your estrogen goes up pretty linearly until a certain point. I would say around 650 milligrams of test a week. Your estrogen is going up, you hit about 650, the curve starts to flatten out a little bit. So it's not as linear of a estrogen creation as the dose increases. So what this means, let's say you're running 600 milligrams of test, 300 milligrams of Primo. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. Let's say your estrogen's perfect, but you want to increase your dosage. So you go to 1,000 milligrams of test and 500 Primo. Now with this dosage increase, your estrogen is actually going to be lower at this dose than it was at 600 to 300. The reason why is because when you go from 600 milligrams of test to 1,000 milligrams of test, your estrogen creation is not linearly like a 300 dose increase like it would be when it's lower. And the Primobolan or the Equipoise is actually going to scale and linearly lower your estrogen. So with the EQ, it's a little more complex, but it actually makes things in real life actually simple and less stuff to worry about. So let's say the 3-to-1 standard ratio test to EQ. If you look at the chart that I posted earlier of like general E2 blood numbers when you're running high doses of EQ and test, your E2 looks tanked, like almost zero, right? But you have to keep in mind, EQ produces Estrone, okay? That's called E1. EQ, out of any compound we know, really produces this at a high level. So basically, E1 is 5 to 10% as strong as E2 generally on the tissue of how strong it actually acts. Sounds a lot weaker, which it is, but when people run high doses of EQ, this is why their estrogen, their E2 is bottomed out, but their estrone, their E1, supplements the E2 and actually gives you estrogenic effects, so you're not completely screwed. Now, people don't usually test their E1, but from my experience, I have tested my E1, my estrone, on 800 milligrams of Equipoise, and it came back at 662. So if you do the math, 5 to 10% as effective, it's going to be roughly equivalent to 33 to a 66 level of E2, which is totally good and totally healthy, and probably gives you all the beneficial effects. But my actual E2 levels on the blood test were undetectable. So that is why back in the day, a lot of people could run high test, high EQ. You hear about high dosages of both, and all the old school guys would bulk on it. Even though their E2 was crashed, they had the E1 supplementing their estrogenic needs. So this is why it could work, which means the ratio basically stays more of the same when you're running Equipoise, and you need to worry less about estrogen issues in the higher doses. But on the lower doses, you really need to watch out for estrogen levels, because your E1 production is not going to be sufficient to cover your nuking of your E2, basically. Another little thing to keep in mind is if you stack nandrolone, tren, or deca, or MPP on top of this, or maybe MENT too, it's going to increase the progestogenic effect on the tissue, which means your lower E2 and lower E1 levels are actually going to be performing like they were higher. So if you stack some sort of nandrolone on top, the actual estrogen levels could be lower and you could still have all the beneficial effects. Another little thing you need to know is that E1 and E2, even if they're equated for strength, do not produce the same amount of IGF in the liver. E2, which is the typical thing we test for, is going to be much better at creating IGF. So just keep that in mind. Even if you're running a high dose of EQ and your estrone, your E1, is at a sufficient level to produce the same strength as E2 at a good level, your IGF is not going to be the same. So that's a unique trait of E2. Just something you need to keep in mind if you're trying to maximize your IGF levels. Other than that, these are just little important things you need to know. Mostly, if you're at the top or bottom end of the reference range of estrogen and you're changing dosages or you're changing compounds, and you need to know how it's going to skew, because, you can have a little bit of issues when you're close, but then as soon as you hit a certain number, you're screwed. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. Just have a general idea of how it's going to skew, and also a good starting point of like knowing how these things work, because they are all important to know, especially when you're reading blood work. For now, that is about all the useful information I could think of regarding estrogen and these compounds. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I have an Instagram now, so if y'all want to follow me or message me, that'd be cool, because I have like 0 engagement. So just hit me up on there. I will definitely reply. Other than that, if you guys appreciate this kind of content, subscribe, like, support your boy. Thank you.